Welcome to this How Do I video on using Visual Studio Team Services to load test Microsoft Dynamics NAV servers that are running behind an Azure load balancer. This image illustrates what I'm going to demonstrate. We have an internet-facing endpoint for the Azure load balancer. The endpoint is shared by two NAV virtual machines in an availability set. Each virtual machine is running the NAV web client and the NAV server, and the NAV servers are connected to the same Azure SQL database. This configuration was demonstrated in my previous How Do I video. Today, I will configure multiple test agents running in Visual Studio Team Services to run NAV load tests against the load-balanced NAV servers in order to demonstrate how the load is distributed by the Azure load balancer. We'll get there by these two steps: configuring the NAV load test to run in the cloud, and then configuring the load test to enable load distribution. So how do we configure the NAV load test to run in the cloud? Let's just go through the steps involved here. Firstly, you need to connect Visual Studio with a Visual Studio Team Services account, and you need to be having a project that's in Team Services open. You then configure the test settings to use Visual Studio Team Services. You configure deployment of any self-signed certificates that you might have for your NAV web clients, and then configure the load test to use the load balancer endpoint for your NAV servers. So let's have a look at that in Visual Studio. So here we are with the NAV load test solution open, and in this case we're looking at the small business user load test. And if we look in the solution, you'll usually have a test settings file in the solution. And for this one, I'm just going to demonstrate here the setting here, which is the most important thing, which is to run your tests using Visual Studio Team Services. The deployment settings here, you need to enable deployment, and you'll need to deploy these two files: the certificate manager, which comes with the Visual Studio development tools, and your self-signed certificate if you're using one. Then you'll need to call a script. I'll show you that in a minute. That's just to deploy the certificate to the test agents. So let's close that, and when we look at the next step, before we go further, just make sure that that test settings file is enabled as the active load test and web test settings before you run any tests, if you have multiple. The script I discussed is actually explained on the Visual Studio Team Services MSDN pages, but it's just calling the certificate manager to add the certificate to the local machine root on the test agent. The other important step is to configure the NAV load test configuration to be using the load balanced endpoint for your NAV servers. And that's here for my case. So now that we've seen that, our load test is ready to run. And if we just look at the settings here for this load test, it's going to be a 100 user load test with a pretty quick ramp up time, and I'm only going to run it for a short period of time just to demonstrate the distribution. So let's start the load test now, and we can see that it's running in Visual Studio because we get this page appearing when it starts. So when the test starts in Visual Studio Online, you can see this status page, and it's actually telling us here that it's going to be running on one agent core, even though it's 100 users, and it'll be using one IP address. And as we've discussed previously, that's going to affect how the load balancer works. So let's just see how the test is going. It seems to have started, and already the load is up to 10 users. So in order to see how the load is being distributed, I'm going to run some queries against the NAV database to see where the active sessions, which instances they're connecting to. So this query is just a simple query on the active sessions table. We can see here already there's quite a lot of users, but as far as I can see, they're actually all using the machine HDI demo 01. So that's because they're all using the same IP address. So while we're actually running the load test in the cloud here, and it is still making the load balancer think that all the connections are coming from the same client, and therefore it has to ensure session affinity by giving them the same instance. So now we've achieved our first step of getting the NAV load test to run in the cloud. We want to move on to the second step, and that is, how do we configure the load test to enable load balancing of NAV clients? If you recall from the previous video, we discussed how the NAV web and Windows clients need to use the same server instance for the duration of a client session. As I demonstrated, the load balancer rules enable session affinity, but they do that by distributing the load by the client IP address. And as we saw in the previous test run, by using the same IP address, even though we had multiple users, they all got the same instance. However, Visual Studio enables us to distribute the load test across multiple virtual agents. But in order to make this work with NAV, these virtual test agents need to have different IP addresses. But fortunately, Visual Studio enables us to do that. So let's have a look at how we set that up. So returning to our load test file, we can see here how it's possible to configure multiple agents for the test run. Firstly, we can specify the number of agents in the agent count that we're asking Visual Studio to run the test on. And secondly, we can actually say that Visual Studio should use multiple IPs. Of course, that depends on the agents, but if we've got more than one agent, then they should have different IP addresses. So let's save those settings and start another load test run. Now that the test is started, we see more details on this page. Firstly, it's saying that we're going to use 4 agent cores as we asked for, but more importantly, it's now going to be running using 2 internet protocol addresses. And that's what we want. And we can see now that the test has started and the user load is getting up to 14 users. So let's go and have a look in the database and see how the users are being distributed this time. So if we execute our query now for the active sessions, you can actually see that there's a distribution now. And that correlates with the fact that the load test agents are using 2 IP addresses. If we go to the other query of session events, we can also see a fairly even distribution, although not quite even at the moment. But as the test progresses, we'll see those numbers increasing. So now that our test has progressed and we've reached above 50 concurrent users, we can once again check the distribution and see that it's divided again fairly evenly between the 2 server instances, 01 and 02. So that completes the second step of configuring the load test to enable balancing of the NAV clients. So let's just recap on the topics here. We showed how to configure a load test to run in the cloud. The value of this is it makes it much easier to create multiple test agents to run your load test, especially if you want to simulate running with hundreds of users. It also allows you to distribute the load test agents across multiple machines with multiple IP addresses. So this would allow you to simulate a situation where your clients were operating in multiple offices distributed perhaps around the globe or around the country. In the case where all your clients are sitting in the one office, you may experience behavior like what we saw in the first test, where all the clients appear to have the same IP address to the load balancer and get directed to the NAV instance. The Azure load balance makes distributing the load across multiple virtual machines in an availability set very easy if you've got a situation where each client has an individual IP address. Here are some other resources that you may find useful. Load testing in the cloud is the Getting Started page for Visual Studio Team Services load testing, and that refers to the scripts I mentioned earlier about deploying certificates. I've also created a previous How Do I video about Visual Studio online load testing of Microsoft Dynamics NAV, so you can also have a look at that to get a bit of background. This video was created in collaboration with Microsoft and the training center Platan. Thank you for watching.